Ladies and gentlemen, it is the Municipal Man of Mystery back with another episode in our series on how to create beats for your Beat Buddy. By extension, any other drum machine or type of sequencer you're using, generally just using MIDI to create beats. And this is especially for those who aren't drummers and you're trying to work out how to, present your vision to people, and you want to maybe lay down a track, create a song, and you want to be able to make your vision come to life a little bit. Even if it's not the final form, at least get the rhythms correct. And so we've been focusing on dynamics, nuances, making beats really work with the rhythm, understanding how velocity works, and things like that. So in this lesson, we're going to move forward with our intermediate skills, and we're going to look at some of the more common fills. Now, there's a million drum fills you can make. It's not a matter of knowing them all by rote. What you want to be able to do is to translate what you're hearing in your head into an audible sound. And that's where we want to go with this. The first thing I'm going to do is set up a window to help us with some tools. I'm going to open a new project in Logic. I'm just going to drag it in from the other window. There we go. Let's invest in some real estate and blow this up. And the first thing we're going to do, as per usual, is create a software track or software instrument track. And we're going to apply a drum sound to it. Any one will do. Let's close that down because we don't need it. Let's take advantage of some of the features that Logic provides for us to help us manipulate our MIDI notes. The first thing we're going to need, of course, is the editor, which is the scissor icon here. Most of our work is going to be done down in this area. Another thing we can do is open up automations, and below there will be the velocity sliders that are going to help us change the impact of the notes. We can also change the view on the grid here, and we do that by first going up to the bezel of the frame. And I'll zoom in here just to show you. You're going to right-click it, and a customized control bar window will drop. And we're going to go here to Beats and Projects and choose Custom. And I'm going to toggle Key Signature. And you'll notice that changes the console view here. And more specifically, below the time signature, we also have the division, and that will change the divisions on this grid here, which we might need to use later. Okay, now that we have set up our window, we're ready to start. We can begin generating some notes. The next thing we have to think about is our input method. The simplest thing you can do is use musical typing. So if you go to Window and you hit Show Musical Typing, this window will appear, and this allows you to tap out the notes on your keyboard. That's the simplest way to generate a couple of notes. Once you get a couple of notes in the field there, you can copy and paste them and manipulate them ad lib. If you have a MIDI controller, that's a type of keyboard, or maybe an electronic keypad or drum pad that you can tap, it will generate the notes in the software. Of course, that's up to you. For our purposes today, we're just going to use musical typing because it's the most readily available. So the first fill we're going to look at is a very, very simple one. I call it the joke fill, and that's when someone tells a joke and the drummer does this. Right, that's a classic. So it's simple 2 taps on the snare and then a kick with a cymbal crash. All right, we don't need to be too scientific about this. We can just hit record. And it doesn't matter where the notes land because we can move them around. First note is there. Second note is there. Whoops, sorry. And then we have the kick and cymbal crash on the one. And to make the cymbal crash, I'm going to Option, click, drag. So it's Option, click the mouse, drag it up. There's my crash. I'm going to let go of the mouse, and that will leave the note there, copied and pasted. So let's hear what it sounds like so far. Now, there's a few things we can do here to change the feeling or the sense of this little fill. We can make the kick a little stronger, and if you remember from previous tutorials, our velocity sliders are down here, so I can actually just slide that velocity of that note up, and that's the maximum, 127, so that's going to be a really pronounced kick. And with the snare, I might want the accent to be on the second snare tap, and I can lower this one down. Let me zoom in there for you. And you'll see that number drop. I'm going to try it at around 80 because I think that's where the original was. Okay, let's hear it. Sounds good. Okay, I'm going to take this opportunity now to do something to improve our workflow. Because we're listening to this several times, let's turn on our loop function, and that will play the loop from the beginning by just hitting the space bar on the keyboard.
And now it's time for a drummer joke.
Thank you. You guys are great. Say, what do you call a guy who lives on your couch and likes to hang around with musicians? A drummer! You guys have been great. I'll see myself out.
Right, let's move on to our second fill, and it sounds something like this. Pretty standard and straightforward. It's a little more elaborate than the one we just did. First thing I'm going to do is just create a new track or duplicate the track, just to make life easy. And because I'm really lazy, I'm just going to option drag these notes that I've already created. Let's mute the top track, we don't need it. And we've got some of our notes already generated, specifically our cymbal crash. I'm just going to move it down. And then we've got our two snare hits, which we're going to borrow. Let's focus on these two snare hits here. Okay, that might be what you want, but we're going to look at how what it sounds like as we move these notes closer together, and you can hear how the feel changes. So in order to do that a little more scientifically, I'm going to change the field view to 64, and I'll zoom in so you can see what I'm doing. Deselect those. Let's hear how this sounds. That might be good. Let's see what happens if we move it closer. Yeah, that's more what we want. And then we have two more snare hits. I'm going to change this back to 16. Sorry, I can't see what I'm doing there. And I'm just going to option drag these two, the snare note out. Put one there, middle, and one there. And let's hear if that is how we want our fill to sound. Sounds about right. So the phrasing is more or less correct. There is a little bit we can do with the velocity to change the nuances or the feeling of this fill. So you'll notice this one is at 80 and this is at 127. If I really lower this down to somewhere half of what it is, you'll hear the change in feeling. So the first note is almost inaudible, but it's there. It creates that popping sound of the second snare hit. But that's not what we want. I just wanted to do that for experimental sake. And these two snare hits here, we might want a little variation. So let's fool around with the velocity a bit and see if it's working for us. Drop this down to about 70. That's a pretty big drop from 127, so it'll create a big change. Let's see what happens as we ramp this up. Go up to 90. It's still not right. Let's try 110. It's getting a little closer to what we want, but basically at the same level sounds about right. We could experiment by toggling this down a bit. And that sounds okay. So So it really depends what you want. This is more art than science. As Eddie Van Halen says, if it sounds good, it sounds good. And that is very true. All right, so that's our second fill. It's a flam with 2 snare taps and then a cymbal crash. Okay, just for the sake of finishing this off, I'm going to play it with the beat that I had, that we heard. I'll just copy and paste that over here. Et voila. So for fill number 3, we're just going to do a slight variation on the one we just made. We're going to create a build, and it sounds something like this. So let's see how that's going to work. Let's duplicate the track again. I'm going to borrow these notes because the ending is the same. So what we're going to do is replace this beat with a build. Let's borrow the notes that we've already got. To make a build, think about what the drummer's doing. The drummer's tapping on the kick, usually tapping on the floor tom, and then tapping on the snare, and then going from a really low velocity up to a high velocity, and then some kind of climactic crash at the end. And so we're going to take this kick here, and I'm actually just going to start with that. And I'm going to take the velocity of that, and I'm going to drop that right down to 1. And I'm just going to duplicate that with an option drag from the kick to the snare, and then the snare to the floor tom. So that's at a 1 velocity. And then what we're going to do is scale that up as the beat progresses. So what we're going to do is select and copy on the parts of the bar. And if you want to go through and count this, you can. But basically, it's going to go here. It's going to go 1 and 2 and... So we got the phrasing right, and if you count it, it's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And then we want to ramp the velocity of these notes. Now, you can do them individually if you like, but if you're using Logic, it has a ramping tool, which is just to do something like this. So what I did there was I selected the ones I want, and then I used that ramping tool to quickly change the velocity. And that creates a nice build. I can change the ramp of that right up to the max if I want. And I can get those really high up there. That sounds a little extreme. Now you can do a little bit with the velocity to change the nuances. Suppose you want the snare to jump out of that build. You're just going to change the scale of the ramping on the snare itself. Just do something like this. Okay. And then the snare will jump out a bit as it builds up. So you can be a little creative with how you want that to work. There you go. That's how you create a build.